Over the last few decades, China has undergone a remarkable transformation, evolving from a nation that often flew under the global radar to becoming the world's second largest economy, which even the United States now regards with concern. China's economic growth has been nothing short of extraordinary, with an average annual growth rate of 9.5% over the past 40 years, significantly outpacing the global average of 2.9% during the same period. Presently, China boasts a staggering GDP of $18 trillion, surpassing Japan in 2010, and it's well on its way to potentially eclipsing the United States as the world's largest economy in the coming years. In fact, China is currently responsible for a substantial 22.6% of the world's total economic growth, while the United States contributes 11.3%. The rise of China has understandably raised concerns in the West, particularly in the United States. In this video, we will delve into the reasons behind the Western apprehension towards China. If this topic piques your interest, be sure to subscribe to our channel before you continue watching. The rise of Japan versus the rise of China. Many people today react to China in a way that's similar to how they reacted to Japan in the 1980s. Back then, Japan was becoming a major economic competitor to the West. Americans were worried when China tried to buy an oil company called Unocal, and they were also worried when Japan bought Rockefeller Center more than 20 years ago. Why? Well, when Sony bought Hollywood's Columbia Pictures, there was a lot of drama and emotion in the US. But Akio Morita, one of the co-founders of Sony, pointed out that Rupert Murdoch, who was originally from Australia, had previously bought 20th Century Fox without all the fuss. Morita suggested that racism might be a factor. Today, racism might also play a role in how some people view China. But the reasons behind these concerns are more complicated. For many centuries, Europeans and Americans have been the dominant players on the global stage, and they're uncomfortable with the idea of someone else becoming the world's top power. Back when Japan was rising, Americans worried that the Japanese were not just competitors but were trying to take away American dominance, especially in business. Japan's economic system was different from America's, and it seemed to be working better in some ways, which made the Western countries uneasy. Japan's rise was seen as a challenge not just economically but also ideologically. Today, people fear China for similar reasons. China has its own economic model called state capitalism, which challenges Western economic ideas. China also behaves in a way that seems focused on its own interests, sometimes disregarding others. It controls its currency to make its exports more competitive and tries to secure natural resources for itself. State-controlled companies often play a big role in this, making China look like a powerful and threatening force. What's more, China's political system goes against Western ideals of democracy and human rights. It's not just competing economically with the US, but it's also offering a completely different economic and political system that, at times, seems better at creating economic growth and jobs, even though it restricts civil liberties that the West values. China is succeeding with ideas that many Americans don't like. And the concerns about China go beyond that. Japan was a member of the G7 and a US military ally, but China is neither of those things. The concerns that Western countries had about Japan in the past are similar to the concerns they have about China today. However, the scale of China's economic and geopolitical expansion is much larger than that of Japan. For example, China is actively promoting its own currency, the renminbi, in an effort to reduce global reliance on the US dollar. Chinese diplomats are also working to increase their country's influence in Africa and Latin America, even aligning with nations that are openly hostile to US interests, such as Iran. Additionally, China is rapidly expanding its military capabilities. In 2019, China independently constructed its own aircraft carrier, the Shandong, and now possesses 3 aircraft carriers. Furthermore, China is developing hypersonic missiles that could pose a threat to US power in the Pacific region. In essence, China appears to be challenging not only the current economic order but also the Western political and military framework. China's growing global influence. In the past 2 decades, China's engagement with an impact on the Middle East have significantly expanded. Presently, China's trade with the region far surpasses that of the United States. In 2021, China imported $130 billion worth of goods from the Middle East, while the U.S. imported only $34 billion. Additionally, China's exports to the region amounted to $129 billion, whereas the U.S. exports totaled $48 billion. China is also forging connections with Middle Eastern nations through organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Earlier this year, China successfully mediated a peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Furthermore, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates have been invited to join the BRICS coalition, starting next year. China is not seeking to exclude the United States from the region, but as China's economic and political influence grows, and the U.S. focuses more on energy independence and shifts its attention to Asia and Europe, Middle Eastern countries may increasingly seek to bolster their relations with China to show that they have other significant global options. A similar pattern emerges in Africa. U.S. policymakers, spanning the political spectrum, have become increasingly concerned about Beijing's role on the African continent as China-Africa relations have deepened in various areas, including trade, commerce, military security cooperation, and technology. However, American policymakers have not prioritized African nations in their foreign policy agendas. For example, when the former President Donald Trump's administration unveiled a new strategy for Africa, it framed the continent as a battleground for competition with Beijing, rather than presenting a constructive vision for U.S.-Africa relations. By 2050, the entire African continent is projected to have a population of 2.5 billion, which would mean that more than 25% of the world's population will be African. African nations are anticipated to achieve a combined GDP of $29 trillion by 2050. China is adopting a long-term approach in Africa, investing in infrastructure projects through the Belt and Road Initiative, while the United States views China's presence in Africa as competition, lacking a clear vision for its relations with African countries. China's growing economic power compared to the U.S. For the first time since the 1870s, when the U.S. became the world's top economy, there's now a rival that's as big, or even bigger, in some ways. China's impressive economic growth over the last 40 years, averaging 4 times faster than the U.S., has reshaped the global economic landscape. If we use the traditional exchange rate, China's GDP has skyrocketed from $1.2 trillion in 2000 to a whopping $18 trillion today. And in terms of purchasing power parity, China has already surpassed the US to become the world's largest economy. If things continue this way, China could surpass the US within the next 10 years. And when we consider purchasing power, China has already become the world's largest economy, leaving the US behind. What's more, China has become the #1 trading partner for most countries worldwide. It's also home to the largest number of the world's most valuable companies, according to Fortune magazine's Global 500 list. In 2021, they noted that there are now more Chinese companies on that list than American ones. For 5 years in a row, China has more companies on Fortune Global 500 than the US. People have been predicting that China's rapid growth would slow down for a long time, but it keeps surprising us. While China's GDP growth has indeed slowed down a bit over the past 4 decades, so has the growth in many developed Western nations. These Western countries are expected to grow by about 1.5% to 2% each year as they deal with inflation, the war in Europe, and the post-pandemic world. On the other hand, most economists believe China's growth will slow to a still impressive 3.5 to 5% annually between 2022 and 2030. Very few experts think China's growth will be less than double that of the US in the coming years. As long as this significant difference in GDP growth persists, China's economy will likely be much larger than the US by the end of the decade. Certainly, GDP size doesn't perfectly align with economic and political influence. However, with a population of 1.4 billion and an economy twice as large as its nearest competitor, China's position has shifted the United States into a new and unfamiliar position, one it hasn't been in for over a century. These are the key factors behind Western, particularly American, fears about China. From political disparities to economic supremacy and global influence, China is making significant strides while the U.S. status as the world's superpower faces challenges. This is evident in the U.S. efforts to contain China's growth, such as the trade wars initiated by Donald Trump and the recent semiconductor conflict under Joe Biden's administration. Do you believe China will eventually surpass the U.S. as the world's superpower? Please share your thoughts and comments below. Also, ensure you subscribe to this channel for ongoing updates on Asian developments.